Well, hi, and thank you for tuning in today. My name is Seth Gerson, and I'm Program Director for K-12 Education here at the National Governors Association. Welcome to NGA's webinar on strategies for re-engaging students during and beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. This webinar will explore strategies, lessons learned, and models for helping students get back on the path to graduation and post-secondary success, ways to reduce chronic absenteeism, approaches for building strong relationships with students and families, and addressing the holistic needs of students during and beyond the pandemic. Please note that this is the second in an ongoing NGA Reflect and Redesign series of webinars that will look at lessons learned during the pandemic and elevate state and local exemplars that can inform gubernatorial education efforts during and beyond the pandemic. Please check out our earlier webinar on advancing equity through state education budgets at the NGA website, and look out for forthcoming webinars in the coming weeks, including on student and staff well-being, summer learning and enrichment, and addressing the unique needs of students with disabilities, English learners, students experiencing homelessness, and students in tribal communities. Today, I'm honored to engage in a conversation with three national experts in this area. First, we have Dr. Bob Balfanz, a research professor at the Center for the Social Organization of Schools at Johns Hopkins University School of Education, where he is director of the Everyone Graduates Center, aimed at enabling all students to graduate from high school prepared for college, career, and civic life. Next, we have Hedy Chang, founder and executive director of Attendance Works, a national and state level initiative aimed at advancing student success by addressing chronic absenteeism. And third, Paul Reville is the Francis Keppel Professor of Practice at Educational Policy and Administration at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He's the founding director of Harvard's Education Redesign Lab and a former Massachusetts Secretary of Education from 2008 to 2013. So Hedy, let's start with you and we'll dive right into the conversation. Set the stage for us. What are you seeing across the country regarding chronic absenteeism? What are the causes and trends that you're seeing right now? And how has the pandemic exacerbated some of the previous challenges with chronic absenteeism?
Well, thank you so much for having me here, Seth. And we are seeing an extraordinary surge and increase in chronic absence. And what I mean chronic absence is missing 10% or more of the school year for any reason, including excused, unexcused, and suspensions. Last year, we saw increases in chronic absence. Data from places like Connecticut, which were able to disaggregate it, showed that in particular, kids in remote learning were having a challenging time getting engaged in school, which you saw almost twice as high levels of chronic absence in remote learners. You also saw chronic absence both concentrated among particular subpopulations, so English language learners. And it used to be that particularly young English language learners tend to get to school fairly well, but the pandemic really created huge challenges for families who can't navigate in the English language so well to keep their kids in school, who might not have access to technology. Now that's much broader than English language learners, so kids in poverty in general. In the communities that were hard hit by the pandemic because either they're facing housing issues, their parents are still working, so they're not able to be at home if kids are learning remotely, or the transportation lines were affecting them. So you saw chronic absence, amongst those kids, among kids with disabilities, among kids with homelessness, skyrocketing. At the same time, you saw transition grades affected. The entry into kindergarten, first grade years, the kids in, particularly in the transition grades into high school, you saw higher levels and spikes in chronic absence. And what I would say is what's so distressing is we all were hoping for a very different return to school, where this could be the start of recovery because we would now all be back in in-person school, which teachers have, hundreds of years of experience knowing how to create engaging environments in-person learning. And this year, this fall, you're seeing again even higher levels of chronic absence. Some of that is because of the fears of showing up. Some of it is actually COVID cases and quarantine. People are still struggling with how to make sure they can deal with quarantine. It's also been an incredible challenge getting kids into the routine of school and then creating positive school climates when kids haven't been necessarily around each other for such an extended period of time. You're also seeing kids almost getting overwhelmed. This is what I'm so worried about in the beginning of the school year. You know, kids were out, let's say 10 days for quarantine, and now they feel so behind. How do they catch up? And the beginning of the school year, so when the pandemic hit the first time, schools closed at the end of the school year, when you already had strong relationships to peers, you already had, you know, you were sort of reviewing core concepts. You were not learning the fundamental concepts that allowed you to keep going. But now we're in a very different situation. This is happening in the beginning of school. And we already know that chronic absence in the first month of school can predict chronic absence for the remainder, because this is a time where you're getting those foundational concepts, you're learning who your peers are and connecting to them, and you're forging your relationships to teachers. So we just saw data in California that was from a subset of schools from the first, few weeks or a month or so of school, and it was doubling of the rates of chronic absence from pre-pandemic times. So it's incredibly challenging, and I really fear that there's also some data. This is data that came out from Ed Analytics, and they found when they were looking at high school kids that there's a group of kids, they actually weren't that affected last year. You know, they were okay. They still performed well, whether it was remote or in-person learning, but it was the vulnerable group of kids are even more behind. So the kids who were vulnerable before the pandemic are even more vulnerable now.
Thanks, Hedy. It really lays out not only how students are being impacted overall, but the disproportionate impact on certain groups of students. Bob, I want to turn to you on something similar. Hedy spoke to some of the reasons for student disengagement. What have you seen, in that regard, and affecting students' ability, in particular, to stay on track to graduation and their plans for post-secondary and the workforce? I know you've done a lot of work on early warning systems. How can that help here?
Yeah, thanks, Seth. And really just to build on Hedy, at the high school level, a couple of teachers at the schools we work with sort of broke it down and said that in addition to all the normal challenges kids have had to getting to school on a regular basis, the pandemic has created 3 additional stressors that were adding, they thought, additional kids to the list of kids that were not being able to come regularly. So there's a group of kids that are still sort of struggling through the grief of the loss of the pandemic. We know that there was a shockingly high number of kids that lost parents, but in many of the communities we work within, folks live in intergenerational households. So even losing your parents, but maybe the great aunt that helped raise you, or your grandparents that you were very close to, is equally as traumatic. And there hasn't been space for them to process that grief yet. Another group is that there was actually high levels, we all have this image of like the kids are dying to get back into school. They miss their peers, and for a lot of kids, that's true. But for some kids, it's actually triggered a lot of social anxiety and stress. And actually in a poll I recently saw, a higher percent of high school students were reporting stress and social anxiety in September than they were in March. And part of that is that at both the middle and high school level, in the middle school level, both 6th and 7th graders are new this year to middle school, right? Because the 6th graders were virtual in most cases last year. So 2/3 of the students in the middle schools are unknown to the teachers, right? Which was one thing Hedy was good. And at a high school, 9th and 10th graders are essentially going through their first year of high school together, which is half the high school, right? So that's creating these transition stresses for a greater number of students. And then finally, a fair number of high school students worked through the pandemic, many because they had to help support their families. And many of them gained agency from that, right? They felt they were, we're fighting the pandemic, I'm staying healthy, I'm getting money to keep my family going. And they found more agency in that than maybe, doing so-so in school. And many of them now are trying to maintain the same hours while going to school full time. And that's very difficult to do. They could bob and weave better when it was remote, and they could do asynchronous work just to do enough to stay passing. Now they're struggling. So those are some of the reasons that are leading to some of the absenteeism we're seeing. As far as like falling off track to graduation, one thing I wanted to highlight for folks is that some of the very first data governors are going to see, or their education advisors, will be from 2020. And there's a danger that 2020 graduation data sends a false positive, because in a number of places I've seen, grad rates could considerably go up a couple points. Now that may seem like, why? What's going on? Well, if you remember, right, when people went out in March, every state within 2 weeks waived their graduation requirements and basically said, we're holding you harmless from March to the end of the school year. So if you were on track to graduation in March, you graduated. And what that's showing us is that perhaps more kids than we thought were stumbling in the final quarter of their final year of high school. And when we took those obstacles away, and many, largest of which was the final exams of their classes, when you think about it, whether you pass or fail, if you're right on the borderline, some kids are just going to be on the borderline and fail their finals and not get the credit, right? That was taken away. So they might actually see a small bump in that year, which might, discombobulate them, because the ones we're really worried about are the class of 21 and 22. We know in 21, course failures were way up, absenteeism was way up, and graduation requirements were not waived in most cases. So that's going to likely send it down. And we also know, again, this year, because again, like the double kids in transition, and also the ones I'm worried about are 12th graders coming back who failed some courses in a virtual environment, have a very small window to do credit recovery. And pre-pandemic, almost all of our school systems adapted, or their only, in many cases, their go-to, and often in many cases, only credit recovery strategy was virtual. So now they're telling kids that failed classes virtually to quickly go back and do credit recovery in a virtual environment that didn't work for them, right? Because they don't have a plan B for how to do credit recovery for kids that failed in a virtual environment. So that might create another spike of kids not graduating. On the positive side, and I'll wrap it up, is that early warning and on-track systems are really well suited to help address the challenges of the pandemic, because everybody experienced the pandemic, but everybody experienced it differently. Two kids in the same household experienced it differently. Two neighbors experienced it differently. And it's variable. Like you might be okay now and not okay next week, right? There's a lot of it doesn't all just hit at once. That's what early warning systems, which use predictive indicators of school behaviors, do. They help you identify the kids when they have the need, right, before it manifests itself in really poor outcomes. Because we can't tell just by looking at what their needs are from the pandemic. We can't assume just from the neighborhood they're from or their family they're from what it is. We really need some good data. We need to progress monitor all kids. And I think that's a change. In the past, early warning systems were sometimes used for the kids we think might be in trouble. We're going to really look at them. But I would argue now it's really a time to progress monitor all kids on predictive indicators and use a tiered response system. Look at the data, look for trends and patterns, find where you can do good prevention work, find where you can work with groups of kids with a shared challenge. And then it's only after that, do the more individualized outcomes. And a lot of that, the tracks are there. They've just got to be enlivened and enriched and sort of, I think, retooled for a very potentially powerful use. And the last thing I'll say is there's some early indicator data from Chicago and Washington State that schools that had strong on-track systems were able to maintain them in a virtual environment, and their kids maintain their connections to school better and were better positioned to come back.
Lots of really helpful information there, Bob. Thank you so much. And one thing I wanted to pick up on was, as we transition to Paul, is you spoke about the stress and anxiety that students are feeling right now. And Paul, I know you've written extensively on this, on sort of attending to the holistic needs of students and staff during this time, the social, emotional, mental health needs, their well-being. the importance of building relationships and reconnecting students with their peers and with teachers. What evidence have you seen of some of the more effective strategies that you can share with governors' offices on how to engage students in this way, some of the promising practices even in the last 18 months in this area?
Thank you, Seth, and thanks for the opportunity to be here with you and my fellow panelists. I think some of the answer to your question is embedded in the question itself. I've been making a big point in recent months about the challenge of bringing children back to school is as much a relational challenge as it is a technical challenge of recovering learning loss. And I would argue that the relational challenge precedes the solving the technical problem of learning loss. We're not in a foot race. We ought to be about competencies. We've got time available to get people to graduation, but we've had students who've been disconnected for 18 months, in some cases alienated and estranged, not only from their teachers and other adults in the building, but from their peers. And suddenly, as my fellow panelists have articulated, they find themselves coming back in. And it's as Hedy said, it's an overwhelming experience for many of them. And so particularly our secondary institutions, which aren't built in any way to really incentivize relationships. Think of the ratios we have of student to teacher. We've got teachers seeing 150 kids a week. We've got guidance counselors ostensibly responsible for 300 to 500 people. And therefore, none of that's going to build relationships. So we've got a lot of kids who pre-pandemic were going through secondary schools anonymously. Well, now, in particular, because of the experience of the pandemic and because it's been, as Bob was talking, so widely differential from kids who've really had every kind of support and opportunity wrapped around their experience, a couple of professional parents at home, after school, tutoring, recreation, travel, all these kinds of things. They're on pace fine, thank you very much. And other children who've been off the grid altogether. And so this one-size-fits-all model of bring them back and let's get going and let's fill the gaps that have accumulated totally fails to take into account this widely differentiated experience. So one of my hopes is that in the that one of the silver linings, one of the quote unquote transformational changes or paradigm shifts that come out of this goes in the direction of personalization. I mean, this progress monitoring that Bob was talking about, we take to the extreme of sort of success planning, thinking holistically about children, not just about academically, what do they need to do to catch up and stay on pace, although that is a task in itself, but meet children where they are, give them what they need, both inside and outside of school in order to be successful. In short, to do for all children, have a default system to do for all children what those of us who have privilege are able to do for our own children. And that is a kind of wraparound service of support and additional opportunities, as far as I can see, from prenatal all the way into their 30s and 40s. I mean, that's what we do, and that's what explains the high rates of success that we have. And so sometimes we overly mystify in a technical sense what needs to be done here, but some of what needs to be done with children coming back to school is meet them where they are at the school door, reach out. You asked about practices. Over this period of time during the pandemic, many school systems have become more adept than they were in the past at reaching out to families and engaging families, at reaching out and trying to find students. And that's the beginning of starting to think about them individually. Every child deserves to be seen, heard, understood, and responded to. But we're not built in our current structure to do that, but now it's more imperative than ever before. And it's doable. We have, for example, in the Metro Nashville district, 60,000 students who are getting individual plans and a navigator, each one getting an adult advocate who is working with them to not only do a diagnostic plan, which incidentally, we aggregate up the data from the individual plan to give us metro-wide information that helps us in thinking about how do we build a more effective cradle to career pipeline. But the navigator also works on trying to help them fulfill and meet those needs, not all of which can be met with current systems, which is why there's a systemic dimension to this, a children's cabinet, which is part of saying schools alone can't do this job that we're talking about right here. It's going to take a broader community-wide effort to make young people have the conditions of success. Schools play a central role, but we've got to bring other partners in the table to help us resolve some of these issues that arise outside of school where kids have been for the past 18 months, mitigate those issues so we can really get children coming to school ready to learn and begin focusing on closing those gaps. So I think it's about relationships. It's about restoring connectivity. It's about schools reaching out and personalizing their approach, differentiating the needs of students and really rethinking the paradigm around which we organize our system. It's not one size fits all. It's not the factory model anymore. We don't do it in medicine. I'm not sure why we're doing it in education, except that we do. We have a necessary daycare function in education that we need to have them rounded up so the parents can go to work. But we've got to, using the tools of technology and other mechanisms, figure out how to personalize it, how to differentiate, and how to meet them where they are and give them what they need.
Thanks, Paul. Really helpful, and not only laying out some of the strategies and specific examples like Metro Nashville, but also this mindset that a mindset shift of thinking relationally as you approach the work. And we've seen an increase overall in interest in cross-agency collaboration. And I think that speaks to some of the work that has been done between the strengthened ties between education and health and human services during this time, but a real interest in trying to collaborate going forward as agencies to address holistic needs. And so we'll be continuing to support on that side.
If I might just, Seth, on that point, I mean, I do think, and we've done some work with the Aspen Institute on this, the notion of creating or calling into existence, whether with formal authority or without, of children's cabinets who represent all those in a community who care about children's well-being and are willing to pitch in. You know, the schools may well be the hub of the wheel, but willing to pitch in to resolve some of and mitigate some of the kinds of issues that are getting in the way. I think the pandemic has been like a tidal wave that's lifted the water off the ocean floor, and there's a lot of sense of urgency and need in the community, which everybody on this call will be well aware of existed prior to the pandemic, but the public is seeing it for the first time and saying, wow, there's so much more that needs to be done than schools were able to do. And we wonder what happened when schools closed down. But schools were never intended to be nutritional agencies or mental health care agencies or healthcare agencies. Yet we've loaded that all onto them, plus get world-class achievement results at the same time. It's just too much. And so we're thinking about the 360 kids are only in school 20% of their waking hours between kindergarten and grade 12. So we've got to enlist a community response to this, and that means partnerships. And governors can help incentivize and support the creation of these kind of mechanisms in local communities.
Excellent. Thanks, Paul. Great addition there. And I think as you've mentioned communities, it's a good time to segue over to Hedy and ask a little bit about what you've seen, Hedy, in terms of engagement by states and districts and schools in engaging parents and families and communities in reducing chronic absenteeism and re-engaging students.
Yeah, thanks so much. I also want to start, before I move into the models, talk also that part of this work actually may involve us expanding our metrics that we're using. So we have those early warning systems, and we've been offering out that, you know, we need to be maintaining, for example, making sure we have working contact information enrollment data on kids. And it used to be that we took that just at the beginning of the year. The pandemic has shown us we had to maintain that throughout the year and find ways to easily update it. Can't find families, can't talk to them, you can't continue that relationship building and problem solving. We need to make sure that every child has connectivity. Having a device, having internet access is important for getting access to resources. If we want to be able to take this more holistic approach, it's also essential for having learning. And some of the challenges of not having connectivity really were shown in the pandemic. making sure that you can monitor attendance in-person and in remote learning and see when kids are having those challenges, and then making sure that every child in the school is connected to a meaningful relationship to an adult in that school and mapping that out. And when you have that set of data, you can do some of the problem solving that gets you towards achievement, but these are the early indicators that a child is not going to be connected to the right kinds of learning opportunities. And then you need a tiered support system that is informed by these early warning indicators. So, your universal, one of the things I think that happened in the pandemic is some of the fundamental building blocks of schools, that relationship building, the routines, the rituals that created engagement, got lost actually. And we're struggling to put them back as schools keep pivoting back and forth between some remote, and in person. But how do we make sure that kids actually even basically know when and how to show up to school, even if they're going back and forth in instruction? How do we make sure they stay connected to relationships? How do you make sure they feel that they're walking into a school that is safe and healthy and trauma informed and has a positive school climate? And one of the things I think that we've sometimes thought with attendance is, oh, we can hire a social worker here, or a truancy officer here, and that's going to solve it. We're talking about need to have tiered supports. And the bottom part of our tiered support system has crumbled some and hasn't adjusted. And now we also have to think about, so the good news, though, I will say, is that during the pandemic, we did find some other ways to create that sense of connection to families. There is some reporting of families both feeling like they had a better sense during remote learning of what school was about, and teachers having a better sense of what was actually the reality in families. We should be building on that. I know we have seen a lot of data that we have to have schools back in person and instruction in person. And I do think that is ideal for most kids, though there were a few kids that the virtual might work still okay. But for the most kids that's the need of, we shouldn't neglect what we've learned about how do we use a whole variety of technologies to be in contact with families. Because some of those you can employ now, even if you're after in-person learning. Virtual home visits, you can do that. And it may be a little more comfortable for both the school and the family. Or there was a high school in Philadelphia that had this idea of the open door concept. So whoever was the adult who knew the kid the best, and they did this first in person, would then open the door so the other adults who the kid needed to meet with would also be there. Then in the pandemic, they did it through Zoom, which in a lot of ways is a lot easier, because we had a bunch of other adults on that Zoom call to problem solve with a student. So one of the things I think about is actually, I've really always appreciated the work of Eric Gordon. He's the CEO of the Cleveland Metropolitan School District. And he set out a new vision for post-pandemic learning. And Eric talks about that learning happens in every setting. We actually have to make learning happen in multiple settings, that you have to have whole human learning, you have to have competency-based learning, and you have to have personalized learning, and use those as guiding principles to organize the work. And he thinks about investing in schools. So, a lot of folks are facing huge enrollment challenges. They actually managed to counter their enrollment challenge because they hired parents, they hired students ambassadors, and they had teachers who went out and met with kids to bring them back to school, and they used the summer to demonstrate what an exciting, engaging school experience would be. So in the fall, they were able to bring it. Now they are struggling again, as many places are with the pandemic, but those principles have really helped them well. And I do think another thing we can leverage is a growing interest and commitment to community schools. Community schools before the pandemic were shown and known, and Bob did so much great work in the New York City in helping to do that. But one of the things I think that sometimes I wish New York City would call out a bit more, they had success with their community schools because they created an amazing data-driven system where everyone could see the patterns. And not only that, but the people who were brought in as mentors, for example, with kids, would have access. So if I was worried about you, Seth, I saw you were absent, I got an immediate knowledge that you were absent, and I could go call you. Community partners, we want them to help. We got to give them the data and the resources and the information to know how to help. Otherwise, they can't. And we saw in New York City, community schools like El Puente really rise to the occasion so that they did the outreach, supported the connectivity. They, when teachers were trying to teach or mix teaching online with kids who were also coming in person, then they had community school coordinators who were there to facilitate the online learning process of it so it doesn't land all on the teacher, and who could then use the downtime. They actually ended up in this one school, in a middle school, not having it that every kid would have to find a different link for every class, but just going on to one class so that you wouldn't get confused about where you were supposed to show up. But that's because they had helps of a community partner who understood their situation and understood their kids. And then my last example of a great example is Connecticut, where they actually collected data throughout the pandemic year, every single month, and then they started publishing it. They published it publicly so everyone would see what was happening around attendance and virtual and in person, or kids who were mixing between the two. They made it geographically accessible so you would know you have a challenge. So then, and this is the governor also very much helping this. The governor then created an initiative called the LEAP initiative, the Learning, Engagement, and Attendance Partnership. And they took 15 districts where chronic absence was a challenge. They looked at where that data was, and they've been investing in home visitors. And they launched this in March and April so that they could get visitors in place who could then reach out to students starting in the summer and then continue. And it was it's a multiple home visit model, because relationship building and getting support from kids and their buy-in to do this doesn't happen over time. I'll leave with one last story where a home visitor was talking about how he had been visiting with this high school student. This high school, he first contacted the father, and the father said, when school opens up, I don't know, I'm not so sure about the health and safety of schools. Maybe a month in, I'll send my child to school. Said, can I meet with you, Doc? The father says, okay, let's meet at this place over the car dealership. And he's like, okay, met at the car dealership. It turns out that father had to get out of the house to tell him that the problem is grandma is totally worried, does not want grandson to be going to school with all these health issues. So then the home visitor talks to the grandma, assures all the health and safety. First day of school, kid doesn't come. The second day, the kid does come, and the kid's been there every day since. But this took what? How many phone calls? How many visits to build that relationship to then make sure? But this was initiated because the governor said, we can use our data. We can see where the challenges are. And I'm worried that the schools themselves don't have the capacity by themselves to do the outreach. We need to bring in that next tier of resources so that that personalized connection can happen.
Thanks, Hedy, and really, laying out the importance of making those connections and leveraging the data to strengthen your ties with parents and families and communities through those examples. Thanks so much for that. And I want to just jump back to Paul really quick, because you've brought up both personalization in the past, Paul, and then also some of the connectivity that Hedy spoke about for leveraging some of these relationships. How has recent progress really been done with the digital divide? How do you see that helping for reconnecting with students during this time?
Hedy touched on a little bit of this in her conversation. I mean, one of the great affordances of technology is to break down the constraints of time and space that lock us into school buildings and limit us, as a report as far back as 1994 said, make us prisoners of time in our school system in terms of how we utilize time for the benefit of children. We're locked into this routine 6.5 hours a day, 180 days a year, and you either get it done or you don't, and you either retain them in grade or socially promote them. No evidence to support either approach, but that's what we do because we hold time constant and we let achievement vary. That one of the fundamental premises of standards-based reform was flip that. let time vary to meet the need and build the competencies of children. Again, meet them where they are, give them what they need academically to get up to speed. And if that takes 5 years, it takes 5 years. If it takes 3 years, it takes 3 years, and so forth. So technology allows us to get around that. That said, our field has been a reluctant field in terms of the embrace of technology. We've been, relatively speaking, laggards in this regard until mid-March of last year. And suddenly people found themselves overnight being thrust into the virtual world and having to make the best of it in what for some districts has been 18 months of emergency response. And in other districts, they've gone increasingly expert at using the technology. But the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. We've taken one or more steps in most of our districts to using technology. And now we've got to think about how we use it to extend the boundaries of school time, to extend service to young people, and who's going to do it. And that's not an insignificant question. When we talk about connectivity and talk about the connectivity of schools, both with individuals and with partnering organizations who can help in this work, what we're really talking about is where do we find the connective tissue? And I would argue that what we talk about in terms of computers and internet and that sort of technology is a technical piece of connectivity that can really be used, for all the purposes Hedy was talking about. The home visits are critically important. All those things that build relationships, having meetings with individual students, which you can do. I do it all day long with my students at Harvard. It works just as well, if not better, than doing it in person. It breaks down geography. You don't have to get all the travel, all the parking, all the things that get in the way of people coming together with one another. So using that tool is one thing, and then getting people who are ready to use it, comfortable to use it, have the time to use it, because it's not just one more thing we can add on to teachers is to say, well, okay, we want you to be available until midnight every night after you've taught all day. We've got to make up our minds that we want to do this sort of differential response and build our HR capacity so that we can meet that in a meaningful and important way. So I think technology presents a great opportunity for us to exploit and take advantage of, but it's got to be intentional. People, we can't just regard it in our field as something we had to use in the middle of a crisis, and now we can put it back in the box in the back of the classroom where it used to be and just let it go. And be something that requires expertise and practice, and a tool with which you get better the more you use it and the more you think strategically about how it can be employed to meet your highest level objectives in terms of connecting with your children and families.
Well, thanks, Paul. And it just seems like we're really at a moment of opportunity to harness some of this influx of technology that's come in the last 18 months to be able to equip students and teachers and families during this time. And so thank you for some of those examples that I'm sure we'll dive into even more as we proceed with the call. Bob, I want to turn to you. And we've seen sort of the unprecedented federal funding that's come in over the last 18 months or so. And we saw at least a dozen states put in plans around student engagement and addressing chronic absenteeism. What are some models that you're seeing that are particularly innovative of using those federal funds? What are some recommendations you have, think both short and long term with sort of the long timeline here for the federal funding to be used and to really reimagine what can happen with the funds?
Yeah, and I'll first talk about some of the programs being effective. They have a common characteristic, and I'm going to talk about, really echo what both Paul and Hedy said about the need for more people and how we can think about getting them. So one thing that ties together a lot of the re-engagement strategies that are working is that one way or another, usually not like in a formal sense, but in a practical sense, they tie into what we've learned about school connectedness. And we basically, when kids are connected to school, lots of good things happen. They do better in school, they do better physically, they have better mental health. And when they're not disconnected, bad things happen. And when I explain how we know they're connected, you can see why the pandemic was so rough on kids, because it took away all those levers of connectedness. So We know kids are connected when they tell you there is at least one adult, even better when it's more than one, who no one cares about them as a person in school, that they have access to a supportive group of peers. It can be formally, like through a theater crew or a sports team. They just be an informal set of friends that help each other, right? But they have access to that. 3, they're engaged in some sort of pro-social activity where they feel they're helping others, right? That's what we often miss about. Adolescents actually are and that's why there's been a big social justice has really captured their imagination, right? Because it really speaks to this idea of I'm doing something for others, not just myself. And then 4th, that they feel like they're welcome in school for who they are. They don't have to radically change who they are to be accepted. Those are relatively simple things. Relatively few kids have all of them, except in some of the most advantaged circumstances. But schools have been able to work through that and sort of build that up, are the schools that are doing better at connecting their kids. Now, the big challenge, and I think what both Paul and Hedy have spoken about, is in general, but in particular, the pandemic both hit high needs communities harder, and high needs communities had higher needs beforehand. And it's an amazing thing that across the nation, half of all kids that are sort of off track to graduation can be found in just 4% or about 500 school districts. Interestingly enough, those are urban, suburban, and rural districts. It's not just like the big urbans in everybody's imagination. There's many are suburban as urban, and there's a good chunk of rural. And within each state, it's no more than 10% of districts typically have about half the kids, and they're concentrated in those places, right? Which compounds the people power challenge, right? We need more people everywhere, but in these subsets of schools where every kid needs that relationship to that caring adult, needs to be connected to peers, needs pro-social activities, needs to feel welcome, it takes people. And those are the schools that are the most stressed right now of adult capacity. They're the schools that can't get subs, right? Subs are impossible to get right now. So teachers have to cover other teachers' classrooms, which takes away any bandwidth they have for student outreach. So my out-of-the-box thing for what to do with the remaining dollars is for governors to help incentivize in different ways, because most of the money is at the districts. How are you going to get more people, capable, supportive people in these schools? And there are some sources when you think about it, right? There's AmeriCorps. AmeriCorps got its own sort of expansion through federal dollars. It takes a while for these systems, so they're just now getting set up. But if they could be massed more where the need is the greatest, as opposed to just who's the first to sort of get a good proposal in. And there's a state commission of AmeriCorps that often has some sort of governor involvement. And that's one of our silos that Paul speaks about. We have an AmeriCorps commission over here and a State Department of Education over there, right? They're not always together. We have state university systems that are funded by the governors, where we can think about having kids, instead of doing a semester abroad, do a semester supporting kids at your high school. And I'm agreeing with Paul, is once you've had some face-to-face connection, you can maintain it virtually. So we don't have it doesn't have to be like, I'm only there for a short time, but it's sometimes hard without any face-to-face to do it purely virtually. And then thirdly, there's this growing number of kids that are stopping out after high school because they don't feel the pandemic has created conditions where they're not going on to higher ed. Those kids are at great risk of becoming opportunity youth because we know that anything that stalls momentum through post-secondary decreases attainment. And they're now finding short-term service jobs where they're getting decent pay because of the rise of the minimum wage, but that's not going to sustain them over time. So to bring them back into through some sort of service work and then connect that back to post-secondary is sort of 3 pools of people, but it's going to take, someone's got to put energy to break the inertia, right? There's got to be a force of energy to tap into that person power because it won't happen on its own.
Thanks, Bob. And that's a great tip about looking at your service agencies as well, which are not sometimes always thought of, like you said, as one of the partners that should be in that work and your state allies. And I think just to pick up on what you were saying around, it's about the people and the adult capacity and the caring adults. We've heard a lot about relationships during this call. And I think one thing, for you and then to Hedy is just around, how can educators be best supported, the ones that are able to come in every day and as we've heard on this call, are overloaded with lots of needs, and even not even within their own school, but their families as well. How do you think you can re-engage, help educators to engage students and families during this time, and some promising models for doing so?
Well, I'll just say quickly, I'll go pivot to Hedy. I really think that we have to recognize that it is solving that, is giving them additional people power. It's not giving them a program, it's giving them some more folks to help out with it, because you can only stretch a human body for so many ways and so many hours. I think it's critical. And one other example I'll give is, again, about maybe a good use of short-term federal dollars, is that to give kids the rich experiences that keep them engaged in high school, that often is things that they do outside of school, like through career and college experiences, exposures, internships, service learning, community projects, problem-based learning. To create that opportunity, the school itself needs time to build relationships with the folks that can provide that, both in those experiences for kids and the supports for kids, because they don't have the person power to go out, because just as the Hedy it took 3 or 4 meetings to get one kid to school. It takes 3 or 4 or 5 meetings to build a real partnership with a business, with a community service agency. Like, it doesn't happen like at a 10-minute phone call. So short-term investment in getting more workplace coordinators, more community school, or just anybody that's doing the outreach to student support organizations, to build the relationships that, once built, can be more easily maintained with existing staff, but can be that upfront thing to tie those connections together with an influx of person power, would be, I think, another way to go.
Thanks, Bob. Hedy?
So I also think we need to be thinking about what are the assets on schools that could be expanded and built and scaled out and could bring in those person power. So I think we're not fully utilizing our expanded learning providers and really deeply investing. These are folks that are already at school sites. Expanded learning providers can also do some of the mentoring. They can do some of the coaching. They can create some of those engaging. There was a new study in Boston about how arts education improved, reduced chronic absence because you create opportunities. I know that in-school staff are, pretty challenged, but we have an infrastructure in many places of expanded learning. I would also say we probably aren't as I think about person power, I also think about peers. And Bob, the success mentors in New York City, some of them were your near peer from your AmeriCorps or from your social work. Some of them were hiring high school students to be peers to others. And now if we know kids are leaving school sometimes to work, why don't we create paid jobs in school that are also organized so that they don't create conflicts between the work schedule and what you're doing at home in school. So how would we really expand out our peer mentoring programs? And you can also do that both virtual. I would also say another way of, I want to just build on what Paul was saying. There's both the people power, but technology. You can do more if you use technology. So e-mentoring strategies, which, as Bob said, you still might need to combine with some in-person, but you can also reduce a lot of logistics and allow people to support their students. So I think we haven't fully leveraged the resources in schools that might allow us to do that deeper relationship building, whether that's peer mentoring, whether that's after schools, whether that's advisories. By the way, we need to have advisories in place. But I will tell you, as a mom, personal experience, some of my kids' advisories were helpful. Many of them were not. I don't think the people who were doing advisories were equipped to do the relationship building, but that's already built into the infrastructure of schools. We got to deepen it and make sure it's working. And it does take staff professional development, but that's the kind of stuff that, again, COVID relief dollars can do. And I think so we do have to pay attention to the mental health of our staff in schools. This is, everyone's been incredibly challenged, but I also believe that relationship building helps everyone deal with trauma. And when adults when teachers have that chance to connect more deeply with their kids, understand their families, work more in partnership, it actually makes their job more meaningful and easier. And I think we could also be using our resources, for example, parent-teacher home visiting, which really encourages teachers to be part of a home visiting. You can do it virtually, you can do it in person, but it's a evidence-based strategy that both reduced chronic absence for the kids who got home visits, and if 10% of the school had teachers doing these home visits, it actually improved attendance and reduced chronic absence for the other kids because it changed how teachers understood what was happening in the lives of students. So if we can think about how do we expand and build upon our assets and increase the opportunities for do relationship building, and also expand to community members, to social work, to our interns, our colleges, our universities, our AmeriCorps volunteers, I think we can start to cultivate that extra set of hands and opportunities, though, because I don't think we always make as good use of the opportunities we have to build relationships.
Thanks, Hedy. And to some of the partners you mentioned there, expanded learning providers and after school programs, we saw a lot of leveraging of those relationships, those community relationships this past summer, and a lot of governor interest in trying to stand up programs to get to students' holistic needs as well as their academic recovery this past summer. As they begin to plan for next summer, I'll turn to you and then to Bob, and if Paul wants to add in, but as they think about that summertime period and how to address some of the holistic and academic needs, how would you recommend that governors can help facilitate some of those local partnerships that can occur to move this work forward?
I would advise folks, again, use your data to start to inform which populations, which grades, which geographic regions. The pandemic is not affecting everyone everywhere, though you want to do that data monitoring everywhere, but the data monitoring will help you think about where you need to expand the partnerships. And now is probably not a pretty good time. Start looking from what happened this fall. It is gonna take a while to both re-engage and then support kids through this recovery process. So you might notice who those kids are, but they're gonna still need support into the summer. But it would help for us to be targeted in which groups, because that will help you know which kinds of community organizations, what kinds of language skills, what kinds of cultural proficiency you need to have. It also might, it will help you think about where you might need to recruit new folks, because maybe there's a gap and dearth in providers, and this is where you want to actually help make sure there are people in place that can fill those gaps.
Great, thanks, Hedy. Bob and then Paul.
Yeah, I'll just one addition. I'll just build on something Hedy said before, which is, and I think in the summer it'd be a really powerful time to do this. Is using older high school students to support younger students in their summer programming, and again, as much camp-like and learning while doing, right? Not like we're giving you more school, because they need this, as Paul was saying, the re-socialization, the reconnection. But where I'm getting at is this is where the two-sided win is that provides it for the younger kids. But I'm really worried about high school kids this summer, that unless things change, the labor market is going to offer them opportunities. And they won't be learning opportunities necessarily. Some will, some jobs are, but others may not. And to keep them connected back to school, if they were, again, this and also this idea of their desire for pro-social activities, if they are being paid a good wage to help younger peers succeed, it's going to impact all of them in a very positive way. And just create sort of a cycle of positivity, as opposed to, well, we don't have enough people to staff summer programs for our younger kids, and our older kids are going out and earning decent money at jobs that don't have much of a future, and themselves then not doing much learning in the summer. So I think it's a key time to build some of those peer supported efforts.
Thanks, Paul.
Seth, I've been on this hobby horse for a long time, that summer ought to be an entitlement. It ought to be a third semester or a fifth quarter. And quite as Bob mentioned, it doesn't need to look like school. Nobody wants more summer school these days. They want the kinds of things, again, that those of us who have privilege do for our children, send them to summer camps where they're active, they're moving around, they're challenged and stimulated intellectually as well as socially. They're exposed to role models and counselors and other peers. They're working in groups on things, all that kind of stuff. I think, you know, we now, despite mountains of evidence that we have that show that those who have those kinds of summer experiences surge forward and those who don't fall back, we continue to be content as a society, notwithstanding our rhetoric about no child left behind, to say, let it just be an accident of birth. Either, you know, if you're lucky enough, you'll get something enriching to do during the summer, and if not, too bad. And I think it's time, and in this moment, we have an opportunity, and using some of this money to actually lean into that kind of promise that we ought to be making and build demand. I think once we do it, the demand coming back from families, from communities, and the results that will attach to it may well be enough to sell it and sustain it past whatever cliff emerges relative to federal funding. So I think there's a great opportunity here to fulfill a long overlooked entitlement that we really ought to be making available to people. I know we're at the close of time, and so just one summary comment that I wanted to make about, you know, what I've heard from all three of us really today is that, and Bob used the term, one of the first articles I ever wrote in my career was entitled Educating for Connectedness. And it was all about the notion that really what schools are about is about connecting young people to purpose, to promise, to opportunity, to hope, to a place in society that for most of them seems to be doing very well, thank you very much, without them involved at all. And now we have these places that are centers of you know, ought to be about educating for connectivity, and can do a much better job at that, by the way. But we're also saying that the schools themselves need to be connected to the outside world. They need to be connected to the community. They need to be connected to partners. They need to be connected to families. And all of us have been talking about the need for connective tissue, for people who do this work, who, you know, you can't be in a relationship without meeting people halfway or at least quarter of the way. And that takes time to do. So if we're going to get serious about doing this, you know, we're really going to have to build that connective tissue. So that if I were in a governor's office, now we're advising a governor, as I once did in my career, I'd be looking for opportunities to incentivize the development of connecting capacity, both for schools in terms of doing their work, school to career, and all these extracurriculars and summer learning that we've been talking about, but also in terms of their capacity to, you know, have communities that had children's cabinets so they can connect more effectively with other partners, community schools, which have been mentioned today, you know, building out a web, moving away from this oversimplification of the problem to say that, you know, we're really in this society relying on schools to create an equal opportunity society all by themselves with limited resources and 20% of the kids' time. And we have centuries of data now to show that that doesn't actually happen. And so sort of designing the paradigm on the heels of this crisis, what we hope are the heels of this crisis, I think is a great opportunity that's open for all of us now.
Well, thanks, Paul. And that's a great way to end up speaking to the moment of opportunity and the need for educating for connectivity, using those relationships, using this opportunity to do so, using the community resources that you have for making that connectivity. Well, I just want to thank all of you for your time today. Bob, Hedy, Paul, great conversation. Thank you for your insights. Listeners, before we head off, just know that all reports and resources from these organizations, from these individuals, will be attached to the webinar when we send the recording out and once it's posted to the NGA website. So until next time, thank you for listening, and we hope you and your families stay well and have a great day.